And so let's see just how good the billionaires are. Breakthrough malaria vaccine, tantalizingly close. These are the sort of headlines we saw in the last 2 months or so when Bill Gates Foundation and GlaxoSmithKline came up with a new vaccine, they say, RTSS, in order to vaccinate against malaria. Now, 800,000 people die from malaria every year, most of them children and most of them in Africa. But this new vaccination is actually a 30-year-old vaccination that was developed for adults, but it doesn't work on them, so they modified it to work on children. Now, GlaxoSmithKline says that they are going to charge for the cost of production plus 5% profit because they don't want to set a bad precedence that they're just going to give it away.
Right. Well, Bill Gates Foundation, of course, comes out of the crucible that is Microsoft, which is a twice convicted predatory monopolist and copyright and intellectual property terrorist. So he's taking all what he learned from that business and he bringing it over to global drug business, which is already rife with copyright abuse and trademark abuse. So why would you have a twice convicted predatory monopolist, running the global health services for this huge profit? Unless, of course, you're delusional.
Well, more importantly, according to doctors, like the head of Doctors Without Borders, a vaccine that works only half the time is not a shot in the arm malaria needs. Anything lower than 70% in terms of immunity is considered a failure. And in this case, Doctors Without Borders are saying that it actually is only immunizing 30% of children against severe malaria, the form that kills.
Well, Bill Gates needs to inoculate himself against himself.
But it also goes with what you see happening. So we started the show with all these bankers claiming that they're the victims, but they have such a powerful seat. They have so much power that they could sit down with Obama and dictate what the policy is so that they are not victims of the bottom 99%. Here we have the same thing, that since Bill Gates became involved in malaria, $10 billion has been donated and dedicated to the fight against malaria. This is a 100-fold increase in the last 10 years. But it's going to a business model applied to a situation which is not very good because, listen, infection surge raises doubts over Gates' plan to beat malaria. So reduced immunity and mosquitoes growing resistance to insecticide is blamed. So the mosquitoes are already developing resistance to all the stuff being used. The usual pattern for youngsters in Central Africa near the equator where malaria is concentrated is to suffer repeated infections throughout childhood, which, provided they survive them, gradually builds up their immunity. So most adults get up to 6 cases of malaria a year, but it's just like having a flu.
Right. So here you have Bill Gates coming in there trying to turn a business or a job that would require X number of dollars, but make it so that it requires 100 times more dollars to justify his enormous fees and his institution's fees and all the people supporting him and their fees. So they've taken the bloated banking model and applied it to health. So they're taking one model in the banking industry that's proven to be catastrophe, and they say, well, let's move it into the drug business because it works so well in the banking business. Let's create a global pharmaceutical business that's equally failing like the bank business, and we'll have this twice convicted predatory monopolist run it. Wow.
It is also, Bill Gates is involved with Monsanto, which has the Terminator seeds, which of course means they can't reproduce every year, so farmers can't save the seeds to just replant for free the following year. The same thing with this vaccine is you have to do it every single year. So they haven't said what the cost will be, and they refuse to tell what the cost will be. So of course, even $1, they say, will be too much for most African nations anyway.
Well, that's why groups like the Swedish Pirate Party are an attempt to inoculate the world against the types like Bill Gates, because he has a view of private property and intellectual property which goes completely against anything nearing free market capitalism or free markets at all. It's all about monopoly pricing. So the Swedish Pirate Party and other pirate parties and the pirate movement are needed as a counterbalance to the destructive elements that are Bill Gates.
Yeah, so here you have a case where the policies being used are actually end up killing more people, because while the malaria goes away, it sinks by up to 90% when measures are first introduced. But then it comes back after 2 years even stronger and wipes out more people just because they don't have immunity.
All right, let me get this straight. You're saying that they've increased the cost by a factor of 100, and net more people are dying from malaria.
No, I'm saying it's a misallocation of capital. There's $10 billion worth of money of people wanting to do good. They see this man, Bill Gates, who gets on CNN, he gets on CNBC, he gets on MSNBC, he gets on Fox, and they say he's a good man, he's a benevolent billionaire. This is what he's doing. And so all that $10 billion of capital goes to him because they think he's a good man. He might think he's doing well within his own framework of life, which is through the patent and copyright cartel. He thinks he's doing good. But in fact, the evidence on the ground is suggesting it's actually harming, doing more harm than good. But he himself is his own cult of thinking, I, Bill Gates, care about these people and want to save them. It doesn't mean that it is saving them, but this $10 billion of capital that would have been available to maybe drain the swamps or do something different, that is instead all going towards this patent and copyright cartel.
Yeah. Well, didn't Singapore just go out there and kill all the mosquitoes? And now they don't have malaria.
Well, we can never defeat those little critters. So finally here on people wanting to do well, Kenya's Samburu people violently evicted after U.S. Charities buy land. So members of the Samburu people in Kenya have been abused, beaten, and raped by police after the land that they lived on for 2 decades was sold to 2 U.S.-based wildlife charities, a rights group and community leader have alleged. Of course, these 2 charities want to do good. They have bought this land thinking, like, here's this capital, we've raised it, we want to help people in Africa and, starving people around the world. We want to save these forests from being chopped down. So they bought the land and gave it to the government. However, there are tribes that have been living there. They've just been forced off the land, and they've been beaten and raped, including by the police, and 3 people have been killed.
Well, they suffer from wealth blindness. When you achieve a certain quantity of wealth, you become blind to other human beings. And the act of chopping them down and murdering them doesn't factor in your conscience. And this is why Bill Gates does what he does, and this is why what the story you just described occurs as it does.
But it's also command and control environment you see everywhere. The likes of Steven Schwartzman have a command and control solution for the financial crisis. Bill Gates has a command and control solution for the malaria crisis. And now, policy all across Africa, where it is killing almost 1 million people a year, malaria, they're basically having the UN and World Health Organization force Bill Gates' solution upon them.
Right, so it's anything but free markets and capitalism. It's dictatorships, monopoly value, and top-down hierarchical approach to problems and command and control. All right, well, Stacey, Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time to go to London and speak with Thomas Mountain, the only independent journalist living in Eritrea. Thomas, welcome to the Keiser Report. Welcome back.
Well, it's good to be on the show, Max.
All right, Thomas Mountain, it's that time of year for peace and goodwill toward men. How are we doing in terms of peace and goodwill toward men in the Horn of Africa?
It's pretty desperado, Max. The life is getting worse there. The famine in the Ogaden is getting worse. The abuse of the Somali people, the war on the Somali people is getting worse. And the one bright spot is Eritrea, where I live, the island of food in Africa's Horn of Hunger, has just had sanctions passed against it again by the United Nations Security Council.
All right, now, a name that we often hear when people talk about Africa and goodwill in the same sentence is Bill Gates. Now, he's hailed as a great philanthropist in helping Africans. Has he helped or harmed people in Africa?
Well, Bill Gates has got himself a malaria vaccine. Just so happens that the malaria vaccine doesn't work unless it's combined with another medicine the patent is held by GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, which there's strong suspicions that Bill Gates has got major investments in. In other words, you get the malaria vaccine for free, but you've got to buy the GSK's medicine to go along with it. In other words, you donate $1 billion in tax-deductible donation for a malaria vaccine and maybe make $10 billion in profits off of selling a medicine that every 5 years the patent has to be renewed on because the malaria develops a resistance to all of this.
Yeah, it's amazing how we're seeing this patent and trademark laws change in ways that are just destroying economies and people around the world. In the United States, for example, there are about 225,000 people that work in the Hollywood film and TV industry, but they're forcing, or the lobbying Congress in the U.S. to impose copyright restrictions and to destroy the architecture of the Internet in ways that will completely obliterate its ability to create jobs going forward, as it has without the intrusion of the MPAA and the RIAA. So here in Africa, and of course Bill Gates, being a technologist, using the same draconian patent and copyright laws to destroy the agriculture industry and to impoverish Africans. Another name we hear in relation to charities, Bob Geldof, who stood in front of a bag of Monsanto corn and said this donation from Monsanto was a great act of charity, for it helped even one child survive. Then the slavery of Terminator seeds was unleashed onto the continent. Another intellectual property patent instrument of agricultural terrorism, Monsanto. Is anyone doing anything to stop the terrorist Monsanto in Africa?
Well, you know, the reality is, for example, in Eritrea has reduced malaria mortality by 80% in the last decade, and they've done it by basic public health. They haven't done it through fancy medicines with these patents that are pretty draconian. And yet, this is the biggest breakthrough in malaria mortality in history, and malaria is the #1 killer in Africa. But you know, Max, I think some of your viewers might be interested just in a little bit about why the Horn of Africa is so important, you know. We talk about the choke point Bab al-Mandeb, the strategically critical Horn of Africa, because every day about a third of the world's oil passes through the straits between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And all the trade between Europe and China and Asia passes through the Horn of Africa every day. So the United States and its Western lackeys are pretty much determined to hang on to this, because the day that the Western powers, the bankdictatorships and the financial terrorists in the West lose control of the Horn of Africa, this marks the day that it's the end of beginning of the end of their empire. So a lot of these things that are going on the Horn these days are pretty much a sign of the desperation we see that's facing the bankdictatorships in the West.
Yeah, well, let's follow up on that a little bit. Obama has sent troops to Uganda, South Sudan, DRC, the Central African Republic. What's going on? Is it so? In the Horn of Africa is really the model, isn't it, for this kind of corruption and militarization throughout the continent? Isn't that so?
Well, I'll give you an example. Earlier this summer, the United Nations Famine Early Warning Center issued a report saying that millions of Ethiopians in South Ethiopia were starving. A few days later, the International Committee of the Red Cross announces that they're being blocked from doing any aid work in that region, in southern Ethiopia. A few days later, the British government announces they're giving $60 million in emergency food aid to Ethiopia. Well, now no food aid is being allowed into South Ethiopia where people are starving. What's that money being spent on? The very next day, the Ethiopian government announces they're spending $100 million buying 200 battle tanks from the Ukraine. In other words, they're buying tanks to prevent aid from getting to the starving people, and this is all being funded by the bankdictatorships in the West. So that's just one example. Another example is in Somalia. In 2006, Ethiopia invades Somalia, destroys the Union of Islamic Courts, which has brought peace to Somalia for the first time in 15 years, and creates 500,000 refugees in their occupation of Somalia and the warfare there, until they're kicked out 2 years later by the Somali resistance headed by al-Shabaab. The Ethiopians are replaced by the African Union, supported by the West and the United Nations, who create another 500,000 refugees by flattening 50 square kilometers or 30 square miles of Mogadishu. So now you've got 1 million Somali refugees sitting in a refugee camp, and lo and behold, this summer, the World Food Program and other Western aid agencies announced that they're cutting aid to the Somali refugees, which they created. The minimum aid was cut by 70%. In other words, they're going to give 30% of the food they need to survive, and they're going to starve the Somali refugees in the process. And then a few weeks later, what do? They're crying crocodiles here, saying, oh, we need hundreds of millions of dollars to provide the Somali refugees with what they need to eat. And all the while, they're spending millions of dollars buying tanks, helicopter gunships, and artillery for the troops that are occupying Mogadishu, which are creating the refugees in the first place.
Well, I mean, you say it's a double standard, but the same policies by the same countries in the West, the U.S. and Britain in particular, are applied to their own populations. So it's not so much a double standard as it is a consistent standard. All right, let's talk about China. China is also in Africa. Are they competing with the U.S. military? What are they doing? What's the model there? Tell us about China's presence in the area.
Well, China in general has played a very positive role in Africa. They haven't come in with their military. They've come in with economic development and putting billions of dollars into infrastructure. In Eritrea, they put in a very modern, high-capacity cement plant. They put in infrastructure for a modern communication system in Eritrea, and they're doing things like this all across Africa. The one black eye China seems to have right now is that it seems like they're going back in and trying to exploit the natural gas resources in the Ogaden in southeast Ethiopia. And in 2007, they were in there drilling and looking for natural gas, which would basically end up supporting the genocidal Meles Zenawi regime in power in Addis Ababa. And the fighters of the Ogaden National Liberation Front attacked the Ethiopian compound that was protecting them, killed 6 or 7 Chinese engineers, and basically shut the project down. Now we're hearing reports that the Chinese are trying to come back into the region. So please, if the Chinese are out there listening, don't go into Ethiopia, especially don't go into Ogaden these days. We heard that the Ethiopian government's carrying out ethnic cleansing in the regions that the Petronas oil company that the Chinese have established in Ethiopia is trying to explore and develop the natural gas resources. We're hearing stories about basically scorched earth policies where the fathers of the families are driven off the land, come back home after the Ethiopian military pulls out and finds their children eaten by hyenas. I mean, this is the sort of thing that China really has got to stay out of, and we hope that they get the message.
All right, now, Thomas Mound, we've heard that there's 2 models in Africa. There's the U.S. is in the area with guns and tanks and warmongering and typical U.S. Seizure of assets. China is there more on a businessman side of things, cutting deals, and these two have run on parallel courses. But as now China becomes more militarized and as the Chinese economy gets more stressed, do you see any flashpoints in Africa where China and the U.S. are actually going to be in a more of a militarized conflict for resources in Africa? That would be something we haven't seen. Do you see this at all developing?
Well, in Sudan, the Sudanese oil fields in the border region between North and South Sudan and Abyei were developed by the Chinese. It's a Chinese-built pipeline that's taking about 500,000 barrels of oil a day out of the Sudan. Now, the United States does not want Sudan involved in the oil production in Africa. China has some major investments in Angola, but the Sudanese oil fields is China's only major controlling stake in what's going on. Lo and behold, we find out that the South Sudanese Army, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, their salary is being paid by the United States. $100 million a year is being paid funding the South Sudanese Army. And on top of that, the so-called Ethiopian peacekeepers, that almost 10,000 of them now, are surrounding the Abyei oil fields, supposedly to keep the peace. The same army that's conducting genocide in the Ogaden is having their entire expenses and salaries paid by the United States. So the United States very much wants to see the Sudanese oil fields shut down and China kicked out of Africa. And the United States, which gets 25% of its imported oil, or 50% of 50% of its imported oil, 25% of its total oil from Africa, continuing to maintain its control over the very important and strategically critical oil resources of Africa. They don't want China there, and I think what's going to happen in Sudan, the storm clouds that are gathering over Sudan, is going to play out in a very, very regrettable way.
So is it safe to say that one of the trends you're looking for in 2012 is more overt war zone in Africa?
Well, you know, what happened in Libya is a good example. The Libyan government was about to set up the African Development Bank, where they were putting $42 billion into a fund that was going to give interest-free or low-interest loans to develop infrastructure in Africa, to build railroads, to build roads, to help South Africa solve its chronic energy shortages. And, you know, lo and behold, you see the NATO attack on Libya and the destruction of the Gaddafi government, and now all of those is up in smoke. So I think military intervention in Africa is definitely a threat. I think the U.S. foreign policy is crisis management. that they create a crisis and they manage that crisis to better loot and plunder the resources of Africa, which is exactly what's going on today. And I think the one bulwark against this is sort of right in Little Eritrea where I live, where Eritreans, we say all roads to peace in the Horn of Africa run through Asmara, Eritrea, where I live, because Eritrea is doing its best to bring peace to Africa, to bring economic cooperation to Africa. And what do we find? The United States leading UN Insecurity Council trying to set more sanctions to destroy our economy.
All right, Thomas Mountain, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Great to be on the Keiser Report, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Thomas Mountain. If you want to follow us on Twitter or Facebook, you can find us at Keiser Report. And if you'd like to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.